My name is Amylou Dueck. I'm an associate professor of biostatistics at Mayo Clinic in Scottsdale, Arizona. And I've been here in Arizona for about 10 years and spent a couple of years up in Rochester before this. I am also director of the Biostatistics Shared Resource for the Mayo Clinic Cancer Center. And in that role, I work with our Cancer Center leadership to ensure that statistics is properly integrated into research, and I also work with the entire group on staffing and assigning statisticians to projects and ensuring that investigators are getting the statistical resources that they need for their research. So in school, I was always really good at math, and I really enjoyed working with numbers, but the practical side of me really wanted to do something a little more practical. So I think people think of math as being quite abstract and maybe not all that useful. So early in my grad school career, I took a probability and statistics course and just very much fell in love with the probability side of statistics. So I took additional courses and ultimately decided I wanted to be somewhere in the field of biology or medicine. So I took an internship actually up in Rochester at Mayo Clinic and just fell in love with the Cancer Center and the work that the Cancer Center does in Rochester, which included, from a statistical point of view, working on clinical trials, as well as various data in the field of quality of life research, and I've been hooked ever since. So my mentors really started in grad school. My advisor in grad school was Sharon Lohr, and she was the one who introduced me to survey methodology, and that was how I really ended up with an internship at Mayo Clinic. So my primary mentor here at Mayo was Jeff Sloan, and he works in the field of patient-reported outcomes or patient survey data, and he saw in my resume when I submitted for an internship that I had some survey methodology work, so he thankfully selected my CV out of the batch, and that was my introduction to Mayo. And then once here at Mayo, I've had many mentors, both on the statistical side and on kind of the general research side. And on the statistical side, one of my primary mentors was Dan Sargent, who was the head of our Cancer Center statistics group for a lot of years. Also on the clinical side, I've gotten a lot of mentorship on how to do clinical research from a variety of clinical folks, including Edith Perez and Charles Aprinzi, Joe McHale, and Ruben Mesa. So when I was in grad school, I chose an advisor based on her work. So that was Sharon Lohr and her work in survey methodology. And I found it very practical. You know, people provide data on a questionnaire, which I think is very useful. So trying to make the most of that data and trying to understand that data, how to estimate parameters for an entire population based on a sample of respondents, I thought was an interesting concept. And you know, I always had an interest in medicine, and I thought it was a very interesting field. And so taking that into you know, doing survey work within a clinical setting, you know, it definitely really interested me, and once I came into the Mayo Clinic, that's really been where my own research has led me, was towards doing patient-reported outcomes and working with patient questionnaire data. So within patient-reported outcomes, I think it's a really great time right now. So I think in the past, patient questionnaire data was always viewed as helpful for informing both the harms and the benefits of the treatments that we were testing in our clinical trials. But now we have new research that I've been involved with through Memorial Sloan Kettering and University of North Carolina, looking at how to use patient-reported outcome data in clinic and how to actually improve the care that patients are receiving based on real-time use of that data. So for example, through a single-site survey study that we presented this summer at the American Society for Clinical Oncology meeting, we showed that having patients report their own symptoms through the web on a weekly basis during outpatient chemotherapy actually improved patients' quality of life, but also reduced their emergency room visits and actually prolonged their survival, which was super exciting to think that just a patient questionnaire could impact treatment and the care that they receive so much that it could actually have meaningful impacts on things like overall survival. So I think real-time use of patient-reported outcomes and using them in novel ways is really exciting. So as a statistician, myself and my group here at Mayo, we work with investigators and we collaborate on all different aspects of a clinical trial or a given clinical research study. So this starts off from the very beginning of a study where we're talking about sample size and what the clinical question is and what sort of data do we need to capture in order to answer that question. And then we think about data management. How are we actually going to collect that data? How are we going to monitor that data? And once we get going in a study, we do monitor data. If it's a prospective study, we'll monitor safety. If it's a more retrospective study, we'll still monitor data to ensure the data is quality data and is going to be usable at the end of the study. And finally, at the end, we will analyze the data. And that's where we can either do comparative research. So if we have a multi-arm study, we can compare between arms to interpret one treatment versus another. If there's no comparator, we could use, say, a historical control. So we could use existing data as a control in order to make determinations of whether something is more or less than what we expected relative to any particular group of data that we have. And then finally, we could just interpret data so specific to patient-reported outcomes. We can use things called effect sizes and actually quantify, say, changes in whether they're small, medium, or large, and or whether they're a meaningful trend based on the magnitude of the effect. I've worked on a variety of projects, and I want to believe that most of them impact our practice one way or another. One potential example, I've worked with Dr. Ruben Mesa on a questionnaire that was designed to monitor patients and measure their disease-related symptoms in myelofibrosis. And that particular tool is used both in our clinical trials to determine whether or not patients are having a meaningful benefit from particular treatments. And that one in particular was modified and then used in a clinical trial that ultimately led to the approval of a major drug that is now used in that disease. So that would be one example where that data that we were able to collect actually influenced its approval and ultimate use in clinic. So data definitely changes over time, so both how we capture it as well as the actual information and the outcomes that are being measured. So on the actual data collection side, say for patient-reported outcomes, so traditionally we would have handed patients a piece of paper and a pen and they would have recorded their answers. That data then would have been, say, taken to a data coordinator who would have entered it into an electronic database, and then I would get that electronic data and analyze it. But now we actually use what we call ePros, so electronic patient-reported outcomes. So initially this was like emailed surveys online or like a web page that patients could access. All the way through now we're using a lot of app-based data collection. So patients can have an app on their phone. They click on it, it can send them push notification reminders, and they can provide data that way. So that's just one example of how the way we've collected data has changed. And particular to that, the electronic format actually makes it easier to actually use the data in real time. So when you had a paper questionnaire, you'd have to wait for a data coordinator to enter it, and then I wouldn't see it until that data was entered. But now when patients can electronically report, that data is immediately entered into a database. There's no data entry errors per se from a data coordinator, and that data then it would be usable in real time. So those are ways that data has changed. Beyond that, though, patients' outcomes in general have improved over time. So with improved care, different treatments, those sorts of things, general outcomes do change over time. So we do need to be careful when we're comparing, say, our current data to retrospective data, that you need to take into account that outcomes may be improved over time due to other changes, not just to the advent of a particular new drug. So those comparisons can be challenging, but there are ways to account for time bias and changes over time in our modeling. So I think it's a great job being a statistician. So I get to collaborate with a bunch of brilliant physicians on a variety of different research areas. So I get to dabble in cancer research, non-cancer research, any kind of clinical area, you name it, and I get to work with those investigators and learn a little bit about what they're doing, and also being part of these very exciting teams. I'm the first one to see those results even before the clinicians do, and that makes my job very exciting.